I was holding a Chase Bank statement that showed $56 million in an account nobody in my family knew existed. The same family that 3 months earlier couldn't be bothered to answer the phone when I was supposedly bleeding out on my bathroom floor. And the woman standing next to me, soaking wet, shaking, willing to hand over her last $400 for a stranger's hospital deposit, wasn't my mother or my sister. She was my sister-in-law, the one they treated like the help, the one who showed up anyway. That was the night I stopped being the family's charity case and started being their worst nightmare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to before all of it, back to a Tuesday morning in October, when the biggest problem I thought I had was a deadline for a picture book about a hedgehog who was afraid of the dark. I lived in a 600-square-foot apartment on the east side of Austin, Texas, on the 3rd floor of a building where the elevator worked maybe 60% of the time, and the neighbors below me had a habit of cooking fish at 11 o'clock at night. My place was small, but it was mine. Every inch of it covered in sketches and color swatches and half-finished watercolors taped to the walls with painter's tape. I had a drafting table shoved up against the window that faced east, so I got the morning light. And every day, I'd wake up around 7, make a pot of coffee that was a little too strong, and drag myself to that table in my oversized university hoodie, with paint already somehow on my hands before I'd even touched a brush. That was my life. That was the life my family had spent the better part of a decade explaining to me was not a real life. I made decent money. Not great, not tech startup money, not the kind of money that impressed anyone at Thanksgiving. But I paid my bills, I did work I was proud of, and most mornings I woke up genuinely glad to be doing what I was doing, which, according to my mother, Dorothy Callahan, was basically proof that something was wrong with me. Dorothy, and she would absolutely correct you if you called her Dot, was the kind of woman who had strong opinions about everything, and the social poise to deliver those opinions in a tone that made you feel like a child being graded on a school report you hadn't studied for. She lived in a 4-bedroom house in a gated community in Plano, wore pearl earrings to Sunday brunch, and had a very specific taxonomy for people. There were those who had made something of themselves, and there were those who were still figuring it out. I had been in the second category since approximately the day I declared my major in fine arts at UT Austin. "You're so talented, Sarah," she used to say, and the way she said it, the slight pause before the word talented, made it sound less like a compliment and more like a diagnosis. Like, yes, you have this condition, and we are all very sorry about it. My sister Brittany was Dorothy's favorite, and she'd earned that spot by doing everything right, or at least by performing everything right, which in our family amounted to the same thing. Brittany was 34, 3 years older than me, and she'd built a whole identity around being a successful real estate agent in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. She drove a white Mercedes, wore her blonde hair in that very specific blowout style that says, "I have my life together without you having to ask," and had a habit of referring to me as my little sister the artist, in a tone that somehow made artist sound like a polite substitute for a word she'd decided not to say in public. She came to family events with listings on her phone she'd casually show everyone, numbers that sounded impressive. A $700,000 colonial here, a $500,000 condo there. And everyone would nod and smile, and Dorothy would say, "See, that's what a real career looks like," not quite under her breath. Then there was Derek, my brother. 2 years older than me, 3 years younger than Brittany, and easily the most volatile person in any room he walked into. Derek had always been the one who got loud at family dinners, who turned every mild disagreement into a referendum on your personal failings, and who somehow always managed to make himself the victim of whatever situation he'd created. He'd had a string of finance jobs over the years, nothing that had ever quite stuck, though he'd never admit that, and he projected this air of financial authority that most of the family took at face value, because he used words like portfolio and liquidity in casual conversation. He married Simone 4 years before all of this. I remembered his wedding because it was the first time I really looked at Simona, really looked at her, and thought, she's scared. Not of the wedding, not of commitment, of him. Simona was 30, a registered nurse working long shifts at a hospital in Dallas, and she was one of those people who moved through the world like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Not because she was meek by nature. I could tell early on that there was something sharp and capable underneath the surface, but because something had trained her to disappear. She laughed a little too quickly at Derek's jokes. She apologized for things that weren't her fault, reflexively, the way some people say, "bless you," when someone sneezes, without even thinking about it. She called me once, out of the blue, about 2 years into their marriage, and we talked for almost an hour about nothing in particular: her patients, my illustrations, a book she'd been trying to find time to read. And at the end of the call, she said, quietly, "I really needed this," in a tone that made me think she didn't get many conversations that were just hers. I noticed things over the years that I filed away and tried not to think too hard about. The way she flinched slightly when Derek raised his voice at a football game on TV. The bruise on her wrist at Easter 2 years before the lottery, which she covered with a wide bracelet and explained as a fall in the hospital parking lot. "I'm just clumsy," she said, with a small laugh, and I said, "Sure," because I didn't know what else to say, and I've thought about that moment a lot since then. The way, at family brunches, Derek would correct how she'd poured his coffee. "Simone, I take it black, you know that," loudly enough for everyone to hear. And she'd apologize and take it back and pour a fresh cup, and nobody said anything, including me. I'm not proud of that. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I was probably reading into it. I told myself a lot of comfortable lies. The thing about Brittany asking questions about Grandma Edna's land, I want to tell you that I caught on right away, that my instincts immediately flagged it as suspicious. But that would be revising the story. The truth is, I'd heard about those 40 acres my whole life as a kind of family joke. Grandma Edna had left them to me specifically in her will, which had annoyed Brittany and Derek in that low-grade, never quite discussed way that certain inheritances do. And my mother had taken to referring to the property as that stretch of nothing, or those weeds Sarah inherited. It was out in rural central Texas, not close to anything I knew about, and I'd never visited it, never had it appraised, and paid the property taxes every year on autopilot because they were low enough to barely notice. So when Brittany brought it up at a family lunch in September, asking casually whether I'd thought about what I was going to do with it, whether I'd considered selling, whether I'd been contacted by any developers, I thought she was just making conversation. I said I hadn't thought much about it. She nodded and said, "You might want to," and then moved on, and I forgot about it for a while. I shouldn't have. Dorothy's contribution to the land conversation came a couple weeks later, over the phone, when she just mentioned, very casually, that there was some paperwork going around related to the estate and that it would be really helpful if I could just sign a few things to simplify matters for the family. "It's just clerical stuff, Sarah, nothing major," she said, in the tone she used when she wanted you to stop asking questions. "I'll have Brittany send you the forms." The forms never came, at least not then, and I didn't push. I was distracted. I was working on 3 projects at once, I was behind on rent by 10 days, and honestly, a deed of transfer for 40 acres of Texas scrubland was not at the top of my priority list. That was mistake number 2. The first was spending 31 years trusting these people. Now let me tell you about the lottery ticket. I know that sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale, and in some ways it is, but not the kind with a ball gown and a prince. I bought it on a Thursday afternoon at the gas station around the corner from my apartment, the same gas station I'd been going to for years, the one where the guy at the register knew my usual order was a medium coffee and occasionally a pack of those peanut butter crackers that are objectively terrible but somehow necessary. I bought a ticket the same way I sometimes bought a candy bar, not because I thought anything would happen, but because it was $2 and there was a line and I needed something to do with my hands. I put it in my wallet, forgot about it for 5 days, and then found it while looking for my debit card on a Tuesday morning and thought, might as well check it. I used the app, I read the numbers, I read them again. I put my phone face down on the drafting table and sat very still for a long time. The coffee I'd made went cold before I remembered it was there. That detail stuck with me, that stupid cold cup of coffee, because it was the last moment of my old normal, and I didn't know it yet. I didn't tell anyone, not immediately, not for weeks. I called the Texas Lottery Commission, got information about the claims process and the payout structure and the taxes, and I found a financial attorney through a referral I trusted, and I started making plans. And sometime in those first few days, while I was sitting with this number, this staggering, incomprehensible, life-altering number, I thought about my family. I thought about what would happen when they found out. And I thought about something else, too. I thought about how I had no idea who any of these people actually were underneath all the performances, because I'd never seen them tested. I'd always been the one being tested. I'd always been the one coming up short by their standards. And I needed to know the truth before they knew anything about the money. So I made a decision that some people might call cold and I would call necessary. I decided to run a test. If this story's keeping you company, go ahead and subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I see every comment. The appendicitis simulation took me about 30 minutes to plan. I know how that sounds, but listen, I'm a person who had spent 31 years being told my instincts were wrong and my judgment was poor and my choices were irrational. And for the first time in my life, I trusted a gut feeling completely, and it told me, you need to know who shows up before you show them what you have. I called my doctor contact, got a realistic description of appendicitis symptoms, the lower right quadrant pain, the nausea, the way it escalates, and on a Wednesday night in late October, around 10:30, I called my mother first. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. Sarah, she said, already slightly impatient, which was how she said my name when she was in the middle of something. Mom, I said, and I let my voice go tight the way it naturally does when I'm anxious, which wasn't hard because I actually was nervous about all of this. I think something's really wrong. I've got this pain in my lower right side, and it's been getting worse for hours, and I'm scared it might be my appendix. There was a pause. Then the sound of background noise, people talking, a clink of glassware. Sarah, she said again, and this time it had a different quality, something between irritation and a sigh. Tonight is the Lakeview Club Gala. I'm literally in the middle of dinner. I know, I'm sorry. It really hurts, Mom. And I don't know if I should call 911 or, Sarah. Her voice went flat. If you think it's serious, call 911. That's what they're there for. I really can't. I'm with the Hendersons and the Marsh family, and this is an important evening. A pause, and then, like she'd thought better of saying nothing at all and needed to close the conversation. Honestly, sweetheart, if you'd chosen a stable career, you'd have health insurance, and this wouldn't even be a conversation. Call 911. I'll check in with you later. She hung up. 43 seconds. I know, because I was watching the timer on my phone screen. I sat with that for a moment. The gala, the Hendersons, the Marsh family, my supposed medical emergency balanced against her social calendar and coming up on the losing end in under a minute. I wrote it down in the Notes app on my phone. Then I called Brittany. Brittany's phone went to voicemail on the second ring, which meant she'd seen the screen and declined it. I tried again. Voicemail again. Then I got a text, maybe 4 minutes after my second call. Can't talk. Showing a house. Everything okay? And then, before I could even respond, a follow-up. Actually swamped this whole week. ER is your best bet. Hope you feel better, with 2 exclamation points. 2, like she was declining a brunch invitation. I put my phone down on the couch and looked at the ceiling and didn't feel surprised, which was maybe the saddest part of the whole exercise, that none of this surprised me at all. I wasn't planning on calling anyone else. I'd already gotten what I needed from the test, a confirmation of what I'd suspected, but hadn't let myself fully articulate. And then, around 11:15, there was a knock at my door. Firm, not frantic, but purposeful. I went to the door and looked through the peephole and saw Simone standing in the hallway, completely soaked, her coat dark with rain, her hair plastered to her face. I hadn't called her. I stood there for a second, genuinely confused, and then I opened the door. I called Derek to ask if he knew anything, she said, before I could say a word, stepping in slightly and shaking water off her coat. And he said you'd called the family being dramatic and that it was nothing, and I—" She stopped. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope and held it out to me with both hands, her fingers a little red from the cold. "I have $400 in cash. It's enough for a hospital deposit. I can drive you." Her voice was steady, but she was blinking too fast, which is what she did when she was keeping herself together by sheer force of will. I looked at her standing there in my doorway, soaking wet, holding $400 she'd clearly had to work to hide from Derek, and something happened in my chest that I'm still not entirely able to describe. It was like something that had been clenched for a very long time just let go. I said, "Simone, come in." And she did. I got her a towel, I made new coffee, and while she sat on my couch in my spare sweatshirt with her hands wrapped around a mug, she told me things she'd never said out loud before. About Derek, about the money, about what her life actually looked like when no one from the family was watching. "He takes my whole paycheck," she said. Not dramatically, just matter-of-factly. The way you describe a thing that has become so normalized, it barely sounds like a problem anymore. "He has my direct deposit going into his account. I get an allowance, basically. He calls it a household budget. And if I spend anything he doesn't know about, he finds out, and there are consequences." She looked down at the mug. The $400 was from money I've been setting aside for almost 2 years. A little here and there, in cash, from grocery change, tips from patients' families at the holidays. She said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. Tonight he called me when I was already in the car driving here. He said if I gave you money, he was going to cancel my auto insurance. And I said— She paused, and for a moment the tiniest spark of something fierce crossed her face. I said okay. I didn't say anything for a while. I just listened. She talked about the account monitoring, the way he checked her phone, the time he'd sold her car to consolidate finances, and then taken 6 months to get her a replacement, so she'd had to carpool with a neighbor just to get to her nursing shifts. The insurance thing wasn't a threat. By the time she finished her second cup of coffee, she'd already gotten a notification on her phone that the policy had been canceled. She showed me the screen with a look that wasn't surprise, just a kind of exhausted resignation, and said, "He's efficient at least." And I thought, not for much longer. I want to be honest about something. The plan didn't come together all at once that night, like some kind of movie montage moment where I'm suddenly typing furiously and making calls and everything clicks into place. It was messier than that. What happened that night was mostly that I sat on my couch with Simone for a long time after she stopped talking, and I thought about the 43 seconds my mother had spent on the phone with me. I thought about Brittany's 2 exclamation points. I thought about Simone's 2-year cash fund hidden from her own husband and the canceled insurance notification on her phone. And I thought about the number in my bank account, the number nobody knew about. And something inside me went very, very quiet. Not sad, not angry, just quiet in the way that precedes something decisive. I didn't tell Simone about the money that night. I told her she could stay in my apartment as long as she needed, that my couch was her couch, and that I had some things I needed to figure out. She went to sleep around 1 in the morning. I stayed up until almost 4, and I started making a list. The law firm I ended up hiring was called Weston and Hargrove out of Dallas, and they specialized in asset protection, forensic financial investigation, and what their website diplomatically called high-stakes family legal matters. I found them through the financial attorney who'd helped me structure the lottery claim, who told me, with a kind of delicate precision that I came to understand was his way of communicating things he'd seen before, that for situations involving complex family dynamics and potential exposure in multiple legal areas, Weston and Hargrove were the people I wanted. I met with them in person the following week. I wore my most boring outfit, dark jeans, a gray cardigan, my hair pulled back, and I sat across from a senior partner named Marcus Chen, who was maybe 45, impeccably dressed, and who listened to me describe my family situation with the focused stillness of someone who was simultaneously building a legal framework and checking every word against existing statute. When I finished, he looked at me for a moment and said, "Ms. Callahan, you mentioned your brother's wife, the nurse. Does she have documentation of the financial coercion? Bank statements, screenshots, anything? I said I'd ask. He said, good. Then he said, I want to be clear about something before we proceed. What you're describing, the paycheck control, the restricted access, the insurance cancellation as punishment, that's not a marital disagreement. That's a textbook pattern of financial abuse, and depending on what we find in the accounts, it may cross into criminal territory. Are you prepared for where this might go? I said yes, I was. The forensic investigation took 4 weeks, and what came back was not a surprise exactly, but it was the kind of not a surprise that still hits you like cold water, because knowing something and seeing it documented are two entirely different experiences. I'm going to tell you what they found, and I want you to understand that every single item in that report was backed by bank records, court filings, and documentation that Marcus Chen described as unusually clean, meaning that whoever had been doing these things hadn't expected anyone to look. Brittany's sterling real estate career, the one she'd been performing for a decade at every family gathering, was essentially a shell. She had $230,000 in credit card debt spread across 6 accounts, some of which she'd been servicing with minimum payments for years. Her real estate license had been placed under review by the Texas Real Estate Commission following a complaint from a client about misrepresented property values, a complaint that had been filed 8 months earlier and which she'd never mentioned to anyone. And she had an active IRS audit for fraudulent business expense deductions on her Schedule C, meals, travel, and marketing costs that investigators had flagged as personal expenses, being written off as business deductions over 3 consecutive tax years. The audit was in the escalated phase, which meant it was no longer a letter in the mail. It was a formal examination with potential penalty assessments that could run into 6 figures. The Brittany I'd watched hold court at family dinners with her listings and her Mercedes and her smooth-talking confidence was one tax judgment away from financial collapse, and she knew it. And she was trying to use my 40 acres to solve it. Here's what I mean by that. The forensic team, on my attorney's instruction, did a deeper pull on the land in Central Texas, and what they found took me a full minute to process when Marcus slid the report across the table. A technology company, one of the major semiconductor names, had announced a new regional campus development in Central Texas, and the State Highway Department had filed a route proposal for a new interstate connector to service that campus. The proposed route passed directly through or adjacent to 40 acres of land in a specific rural county. My 40 acres. Developers had been in contact with a real estate broker about acquiring that parcel in the preceding 3 months. The broker, according to the developer's own records, had represented themselves as the authorized agent of the property owner and had been in advanced conversations about a sale. The broker's name on file was Brittany Callahan. I had never authorized Brittany Callahan to represent me in any capacity. She had been negotiating to sell my land, worth somewhere in the range of $7 to $9 million in the current market, while planning to get me to sign a deed of transfer for $200 and the family's gratitude. The deed hadn't arrived yet. She was waiting until Thanksgiving, when the whole family would be together and the social pressure would be at maximum. Marcus looked at me after I finished reading and said, "The broker fraud exposure here is significant. We're going to file an injunction before the holiday." Derek was the one that made the whole room feel different when Marcus walked me through it. Because what Derek had done wasn't just financial abuse of Simone, though it was that, thoroughly and systematically. It was fraud on a scale that had been hiding in plain sight right up until someone looked. He had taken Simone's salary, her nursing income from 4 years of 12-hour shifts, and routed it through shell accounts in a way that made it functionally invisible to her. Fine. Terrible, but not surprising at that point. What was surprising, what made Marcus use the phrase potentially federal, was what he'd done with Dorothy's house. Weston and Hargrove's forensic team had found a deed of trust filed on Dorothy's Plano property, a 4-bedroom house in a gated community worth well over $1 million, listing Derek as the borrower and carrying a $550,000 balance with a private lending company. Dorothy's name appeared on the deed as co-signer. Her signature was on the documents. Dorothy had told Marcus's associate, during an early courtesy call to discuss the scope of the estate issues, that she had no idea the property had been used as collateral for anything. She had never signed those documents. In addition to the primary deed of trust, Derek had opened a home equity line of credit against the same property for $180,000, also with Dorothy's forged signature. He had been intercepting Dorothy's physical mail, the overdue notices, the foreclosure warnings, by having them rerouted to a P.O. box he controlled, so that Dorothy, living in her house, attending her galas, presenting her pearl earring face to the world, had no idea that her home was in foreclosure proceedings. The notices had been going out for 7 months. Weston and Hargrove's team found the P.O. box through a registered agent filing on one of Derek's shell LLCs. Inside the paper trail was a signature forgery on a federal lending document, which was, as Marcus stated plainly, wire fraud, the kind with potential federal charges. I sat with that information for a long time. Thanksgiving at my mother's house had its own logic, its own rhythms, its own way of organizing people into hierarchies that everyone pretended weren't there. The invitation, such as it was, came from Dorothy directly, via a text message 3 days before the holiday that said, "We're doing Thanksgiving at the house. Expect you around 2. Can you bring something from the bakery?" Not a question. She specified the bakery and the item, a pecan pie, $12, in a follow-up text, as if she wanted the contribution to be documented at its precise market value. Simone had been staying at a hotel by then. I'd moved her out of my apartment and into a mid-range extended stay suite I was covering, told her to rest and not to say anything to Derek about where she was. And I called her the night before to tell her what was going to happen. "You don't have to come," I said. "I can handle it." She said, "I want to be there." I said, "Okay." Then I said, "Wear something you feel good in." She laughed a little, which was one of the first genuine laughs I'd heard from her in a while, and said, "I don't have anything like that." I said, "You will by morning." I sent a car service to the hotel at 9 a.m. with a note and a Nordstrom gift card. She texted me a photo at 11, a deep green wool coat, simple and elegant, with the single word, Sarah. And I sent back a heart and got in my car and drove to Plano. The house smelled the same as it always did, that particular combination of Dorothy's preferred candle brand, something with vanilla and cedar, and the lingering scent of whatever Simone had been cooking, because Simone was the one who cooked the Thanksgiving dinner. All of it. Dorothy acknowledged this in the way she acknowledged most of Simone's contributions, which was by not acknowledging it at all. I arrived to find Simone alone in the kitchen, surrounded by 14 people's worth of food in various stages of preparation. Her coat, her own coat, a thin fleece thing, hung on a hook near the back door, and her eyes slightly glassy from standing in a hot kitchen for 4 hours. "She's got us on the kitchen schedule," Simone said quietly when I came in, with that small, flat tone she used to describe things that were absurd without calling them absurd. "I'm on dishes through dessert." There were 13 other people in the living room and dining room who appeared to be doing absolutely nothing. Dorothy found me about 20 minutes after I arrived, when I was making myself useful cutting bread in the kitchen, because I couldn't stand in the living room and make small talk. She came in, looked at me, looked at what I was doing, and said, in front of 2 of her book club friends, who were technically helping by standing near the wine, "Oh, good, Sarah. You can start on the sink situation after dinner. We'll need some extra hands." Not asked, assigned. I said, "Sure, Mom," because I was playing this very carefully, and she gave me a brief smile that said, "Good, you're cooperating," and went back to the living room where Brittany was refilling her Prosecco and holding court about a listing she was finalizing in Highland Park. It took everything I had not to look at Brittany's face too long. I knew what I knew. She didn't know I knew it. That particular asymmetry, I was beginning to understand, was a form of power. Brittany got to me around 3, while people were filling plates at the buffet Dorothy had set up in the dining room. She materialized at my shoulder with her Prosecco glass and said, "Hey, quick thing," in the casual voice she used when she wanted something and wanted you to not notice she wanted it. "That land thing, We really should get that sorted before year end. I've had some preliminary conversations with a developer, just exploratory, obviously nothing I'd do without your okay. But the window on the offer is closing, and I just want to make sure you have all the information. She tilted her head slightly, and her smile was the smooth, professional one she used with clients, warm, but with something measured underneath. I can send you the paperwork this week. It's seriously straightforward, Sarah. You sign, we handle everything, and you get a clean $200 out of it. No hassle, no taxes to worry about, just done. I took a bite of turkey. I chewed it. I said, "Yeah, let me think about it," in a vague, slightly distracted way, and she nodded like that was good enough for now and moved on. My heart was doing something fast and complicated, but my face wasn't. I was getting good at that. The Derek explosion happened during the meal itself, which was the thing about Derek. He had no sense of timing, or maybe he had a very deliberate sense of timing, and the timing was always when everyone is watching and there's nowhere to go. He'd been drinking since noon, which I'd clocked when I arrived, and by the time we were all seated, he had that particular quality of controlled loudness that drunk men get when they're performing composure. Simone had arrived about 40 minutes into the meal, slipping in through the front door in her green coat, and I watched the table register her arrival with varying degrees of discomfort. Dorothy with a tightening around the eyes, Brittany with a tiny contemptuous smile, Derek with something that started as surprise and moved quickly to a cold, flat anger that he was visibly banking for later. Simone sat down across from me and gave me a small look that said, "I'm here." I nodded. It happened when someone at the table mentioned Simone had driven herself, which somehow led to someone asking about her car, which led to Derek saying, loudly enough that the table went quiet, "She doesn't have insurance right now." He said it the way you announce a fact, not the way you admit a failure. "I had to cancel it," he continued, and he looked at Simone with a particular expression that dared her to respond, because she made some financial decisions this month without consulting me first. We're working on it. There was a beat of silence at the table. Dorothy looked at her plate. Brittany took a sip of her wine. Several people studied the centerpiece. I put my fork down. I said, "That's not okay, Derek." He looked at me slowly, the way a person looks when they've just registered something unexpected. "Excuse me?" "What you just described," I said, and I kept my voice level, which was harder than it sounds, "is financial abuse. You're penalizing Simone for spending her own money on someone else, and you announced it in front of the family as a way to humiliate her. That's not a marital disagreement. That's coercive control." I said it the way Marcus Chen had said it to me, plainly, like a fact, without the emotional register that men like Derek have learned to use against you. The table was very quiet. Derek's face went through several colors in rapid succession. Are you seriously coming into my mother's house on Thanksgiving and accusing me of—" He laughed, short and sharp, and leaned back in his chair. Okay, Sarah. I'm going to need you to stay in your lane. You're a freelance cartoonist who lives in a 600-square-foot box, and you want to lecture me about family finances? That's really rich. I'm just saying what I'm observing, I said. What you're observing, he said, and now the controlled loudness was starting to crack at the edges, is a husband managing his household, which is none of your business, which you would understand if you'd ever actually been in a functioning adult relationship instead of whatever you've— Derek. Dorothy's voice cut across the table like a blade. Enough. She said it to me, not to him. She said it to me. I noted that. I said nothing. Simone was looking at the table, her hands in her lap, and I could see the line of her jaw, tight and controlled. After dinner, when people were moving toward the living room, and Dorothy's book club friends were loudly appreciating the pie I'd brought from the bakery, Dorothy pulled me aside near the hallway. She was holding a legal-sized envelope, which she'd apparently had on the sideboard the whole evening. She held it out to me with the matter-of-fact efficiency she used for things she'd already decided were settled. "I need you to sign these tonight, Sarah," she said. "It's the deed paperwork for Edna's land. We found a buyer. It's nothing spectacular, but it cleans things up, and Brittany's been very generous to handle it." She opened the envelope and slid out a multi-page document, already tabbed with little sticky arrows at the signature lines. There's a $200 consideration in here for your trouble. She said it exactly like that. For your trouble. I took the document. I looked at it. I looked at the signature lines with my name printed under them in neat typescript. I looked at the consideration amount, which was literally typed as $200 in a box near the bottom. I looked at my mother. She was watching me with that patient, slightly waiting for you to catch up expression she'd had my entire life. And I said, very calmly, I'm going to need to have my legal representative review this before I sign anything. Can I have 72 hours? A flicker of something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. It's just a formality, Sarah. There's nothing to review. I'm sure that's true, I said, but I'd feel better having someone look at it. It's real property. It's a legal instrument. I'm sure you'd do the same. I folded the document and put it in my purse. There was a pause. Then Dorothy said smoothly, Of course, but I want you to know that if this drags on, there are certain complications that could arise, involving Simone. She said it the way you mentioned the weather. There's been a family piece of jewelry missing for some time, a brooch that belonged to Edna, and Derek and I feel that we know where it went. If this becomes a matter for the authorities, Simone's nursing license could become complicated. She gave me a small, specific smile. We'd hate for that to happen. She seems to enjoy her work. I looked at my mother for a long moment. Outside, through the dining room window, I could see the lights of the Plano suburbs, street after street of immaculate houses. I said, noted, and I went to find my coat. I sat in the parking lot of a Target about 2 miles from Dorothy's house at 1:50 in the morning. The store was closed, the lot was empty, and the parking lot lights were doing that orange-amber thing they do against a dark sky that always makes the middle of the night feel slightly more cinematic than it actually is. I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that. Not because crying would have been wrong, but because people sometimes use crying as a measure of whether something really got to you. And the truth was that I had gone somewhere else entirely. I was past crying. I was in the place past crying where everything is very still and very cold and very clear. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat and I started typing. I sent Marcus Chen a 3-page email at 2 a.m. I attached photographs of the deed of transfer Dorothy had given me. I'd taken pictures of every page before I put it in my purse. I described the conversation about the brooch, the threat to Simone's license, and Brittany's comments at dinner about the developer window. Then I typed, I'm ready to move. What's the fastest timeline? His response came at 6:48 the following morning, which I am fairly sure means he did not go to sleep either. It said in its entirety, injunction on the land sale filed overnight. Developer formally notified. We'll have the full package ready in 8 days. Come in Thursday. The 8 days between that Thanksgiving and the meeting were the most productive of my life. I found Simone a proper hotel, not the extended stay, an actual hotel in downtown Dallas with a room service menu and a king bed and a bathtub she texted me about with a string of water droplet emojis. And I told her to rest. I worked with Weston and Hargrove's team on the land sale, conducting the transaction directly through my attorney with the developer, who was, it turned out, extremely relieved to be negotiating with an actual authorized party rather than Brittany's unauthorized brokerage. The final sale price came in at $9,200,000. I signed those papers on a Wednesday afternoon while eating a turkey sandwich at the conference table in Marcus's office. And I thought about Grandma Edna, who had worn her hair in 2 braids well into her 70s, and had once told me that the only thing she owned that nobody could take from her was good judgment. Everything else, she'd said, is just paperwork. I didn't know yet that I was going to end that story with those words. The Meridian Crest LLC situation, I should explain. When Marcus's team identified the foreclosure on Dorothy's property, when they confirmed that Derek had been intercepting the mail and that the house was actively in foreclosure with 7 months of arrears, there was a decision to make. The property was going to auction regardless of what I did. The foreclosure was beyond the point of simple remedy. What I chose to do was have Meridian Crest LLC, a company I'd formed a week after the lottery claim, on Marcus's advice, as a holding vehicle for real estate assets, submit a cash bid at the foreclosure auction. The bid came in above the reserve. The property was transferred to Meridian Crest LLC. My mother did not know the property had been auctioned because Derek had been intercepting the notices. My mother did not know that Meridian Crest LLC was mine. She found out both of these things on the same day, in the same room. From me. I'm going to tell you about that room now. Brittany's office was in a glass-fronted building in the Uptown district of Dallas, on the 4th floor, with a window view of the street below and that particular polished aesthetic of real estate offices. Neutral tones, framed landscape photos, a credenza with a branded water bottle display. She'd agreed to the meeting because I'd asked for it through my attorney's office as a consultation regarding the Central Texas property, and I'd kept it vague enough that she'd thought she was walking into something she could manage. She was sitting behind her desk when Simone and I came in together, and I watched her face do a quick recalibration when she saw Simone. Simone in her green coat, her posture different, her eyes steady. A flicker. Then Brittany's professional smile came back on, and she said, "Oh, I didn't realize Simone was joining us. Derek know you're here?" She looked at Simone when she said it. Classic. Classic Brittany. "He does not," Simone said pleasantly, and sat down. I set 3 folders on Brittany's desk, manila folders, the plain kind, nothing dramatic. I set them down the way you'd set down a plate at a restaurant, not with force, just with intention. Brittany looked at them. Then she looked at me. "What is this, a game?" she said, with a small laugh that was almost convincing. "No," I said. I opened the first folder. "This is an active IRS examination of your Schedule C filings for the past 3 tax years, which you've been in for 4 months and haven't mentioned to any of us." I set the relevant document face up on her desk. I watched her. Nothing on my face. The examination includes flagged deductions totaling approximately $94,000 across meals, travel, and marketing that the IRS is classifying as personal expenses. I let that sit there for a second. Then, "Your real estate license is currently under review by TREC following a client misrepresentation complaint filed in February. We have a copy of the complaint." Brittany's jaw had gone very slightly tight. Her fingers were resting on the edge of the desk, and she was not moving them. "Sarah, I'm not done," I said, not unkindly. I opened the second folder. "This is a broker representation agreement that was submitted on your behalf to the development company in Central Texas, representing yourself as the authorized agent of the landowner, me, without any actual authorization from me, in connection with a proposed sale of 40 acres for which the current market value is approximately $9 million. I paused. "The document you brought to me at Thanksgiving offered me $200 for the same property." I looked at her. "The developer has confirmed the conversations in writing. The injunction our office filed last week is in here as well." Brittany put her hands flat on the desk and said, with a control that was genuinely impressive, "I was trying to help you. You never would have done anything with it on your own. You never—" "Brittany." I said it the same way Dorothy said my name, with that same quality of ending a conversation. "It worked." She stopped. I opened the third folder. "This is the forensic financial report on Derek. It covers the rerouting of Simone's salary to offshore-linked accounts, the fraudulent home equity line of credit against Mom's house for $180,000, the deed of trust filed against Mom's property for $550,000, the forged signature on the federal lending documents." I watched something happen in Brittany's expression that I'd never seen before, a kind of crack running through the surface, and I understood that she had known. Not the details, maybe, but she'd known something was wrong with Derek's finances, and she'd been hoping it wasn't her problem. And the mail interception, which begins approximately 7 months ago based on the P.O. Box registration. The federal signature forgery has been referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The room was very quiet. Brittany's attorney, she'd brought a youngish guy who'd been sitting to the side taking notes and who had gone very still approximately 3 minutes into my presentation, was holding his pen above his notepad and not writing anything. I slid the divorce papers across the desk toward Brittany. "These aren't for you," I said. "These are for Derek to sign. I'm leaving them here because you'll see him before I do." They include a full demand for restitution of Simone's rerouted income, 4 years of nursing salary at her documented rate, and a requirement for a protective order. The child support and alimony provisions are in the appendix. I folded my hands on the table. Derek has 2 choices. He signs these voluntarily, which means his cooperation will be noted in the forensic report submitted to the U.S. Attorney. Or he doesn't, and we proceed without that notation. I looked at Brittany's attorney when I said this because he needed to hear it too. I reached into my bag and removed one more document, a single sheet, and set it on the desk. It was the notice of transfer for the Plano property. Meridian Crest LLC. Recorded transfer date. Purchase amount. Mom's house went to foreclosure auction last month, I said. Derek had been intercepting the notices. Mom didn't know. The property was purchased at auction by a real estate holding company. I paused. That's my company. Another pause. She has 60 days. I said it without pleasure. I want to be clear about that. I said it without pleasure because Dorothy Callahan was my mother, and the fact that she had made herself into someone I had to do this to was its own particular kind of grief, the kind that doesn't look like grief from the outside. Brittany was staring at me, just staring. The Prosecco and Highland Park listings version of my sister had simply left the room, and what was sitting across from me was something stripped and stunned. "Who are you?" she said finally, and I didn't know if it was an accusation or a genuine question. I picked up my bag. Simone stood. I said, and I kept my voice even, because I'd been saving this, not for drama, but because it was accurate. "You told me poverty was a choice, Mom. Turns out, so is this." I said it to Brittany, but I was thinking of Dorothy, because they'd both said that to me in different ways at different times, and it was true about all of them. Then I walked out. The bank statement I showed them that day, the one I slid across the desk at the end, almost as an afterthought, the account balance line showing $56 million, I had printed it that morning. I'd looked at it for a long time before I put it in my bag. I thought about the Tuesday morning in October when I'd found that lottery ticket in my wallet and sat very still at my drafting table while the coffee went cold. I thought about how small everything had seemed before that number, and how strange it was that the number hadn't actually changed the thing that mattered most, which was standing outside that building in the Dallas afternoon light with Simone next to me, her green coat bright against the gray sky, both of us not saying anything for a minute because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. "Are you okay?" she asked after a while. I thought about it. "I think so," I said. "You?" She looked up at the sky, then back at me. "I think I'm going to be," she said. We went and got dinner. Not anything fancy. A diner on the edge of Uptown with vinyl booths and coffee that came in those thick ceramic mugs that retain heat forever, and a laminated menu with too many options, and a server who called us both hun and meant it. We sat there for almost 2 hours and talked about everything except what had just happened, which felt right. We talked about a TV show Simone had been watching in the hotel, something about people competing to build tiny houses. We talked about a children's book I was working on, about a girl who could talk to bridges. We ate grilled cheese and sweet potato fries and split a slice of coconut cream pie. At one point, Simone looked across the table at me and said, quietly, "I've been scared for a really long time. I don't think I realized how long until right now." I said, "I know." She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me. Just let people be good to you. Start practicing." The condo I found for Simone was in a building in the Oak Lawn neighborhood of Dallas. 14 floors, a rooftop garden, floor-to-ceiling windows in the main room that faced west so she'd have the evening light. It was listed at $1.2 million, and I paid cash through Meridian Crest with a deed going directly into Simone's name. No intermediary, no trust, just hers outright. Her name on the title, her building. The trust, $4 million, structured as a domestic asset protection trust with a staggered distribution schedule that Marcus had designed specifically to be resistant to any future litigation attempts by Derek, was established the same week. I sat in Marcus's office while he walked Simone through the documents, and I watched her face as she read the principal amount. And she stopped reading and looked at me and said, "Sarah, I can't." And I said, "You already did. You showed up in the rain with $400 when nobody else would." She looked down at the paper. Then she picked up the pen and signed. Here's what happened to the rest of them, as best as I know it. And I want to be honest that as best as I know it is doing real work in that sentence, because I made a deliberate choice somewhere around month 3 after the Brittany meeting to stop keeping close track of Derek and Dorothy and Brittany's specific trajectories. Not because I didn't care, but because continuing to monitor their unraveling would have required me to keep a part of my attention permanently anchored in a version of my life I was done with. What I know is this: Derek was served with the divorce documents, and his attorney advised him to sign them, which he did, on a Monday afternoon in a conference room at Weston and Hargrove, in the presence of Marcus and 2 other partners and his own representation. He looked, Marcus told me later, exactly like a person who had run out of other people's resources to use. The federal wire fraud referral was proceeding through its own timeline, separate from anything I could control or wanted to. Derek had moved into a rented room in a suburb I couldn't place on a map and appeared to be fighting 3 different civil suits simultaneously, which is its own kind of occupation. Simone had filed a separate civil claim for the rerouted salary and was represented by an attorney I'd referred her to, not Weston and Hargrove, someone specifically focused on financial abuse cases in Texas family law. Brittany's IRS examination completed its process and resulted in assessments I won't quote because I was told the formal numbers and found them slightly surreal. Her real estate license was revoked by TREC in January. The broker fraud investigation related to the Central Texas land was in a separate civil proceeding that her attorney was negotiating. She had sold the Mercedes by February. I heard through an old family friend that she was working at a property management company in Fort Worth as a leasing agent, not a broker, just a leasing agent. And I thought about that for a minute and let myself feel the complicated thing I felt about it, which was not quite satisfaction and not quite pity, and something in between that didn't have a clean name. Dorothy left the Plano house. She had to. She had 60 days. And went to stay with a cousin of hers in Louisiana, a woman named Patricia I'd met exactly twice at family events, and who apparently had room and willingness. I drafted a letter for Marcus to send her, explaining that Meridian Crest had no intention of pursuing the rent at fair market value, but that a modest monthly payment would be required after the grace period. I made the monthly payment number modest intentionally. Not out of sentimentality exactly, more because I could, and I decided that having the choice was enough. She did not call me. I did not call her. There was a long time, in the early months, when I waited for some feeling about that to arrive, some grief, some anger, some need for acknowledgement. And what came instead was something quieter, a kind of peace that felt less like forgiveness and more like simply being done, like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying for so long you'd stop noticing the weight until it was gone. I moved my studio around month 4. Not a new apartment, a proper studio space, a separate room I rented in a building on South Congress in Austin, where a bunch of artists and photographers and architects had their working spaces. A big, light-filled room with concrete floors and north-facing skylights that flooded the space with the kind of even, soft daylight that illustrators dream about. I had my drafting table moved in, and the long work table for watercolors, and a couch that was technically for meeting clients, but was actually for napping at 2 p.m. when the light was doing something particularly good, and I'd been at the table since 6. I was working on the bridge book, the one about the girl who could talk to bridges, and it was the most fully itself of anything I'd ever drawn. I could feel the difference in every line, the way you can feel the difference between drawing because you have to and drawing because you're actually present in what you're making. My editor called it luminous, which is a word editors use sometimes and usually sounds a little hyperbolic. But this time, I didn't argue. I found the drawing in a box I'd never properly unpacked, buried under college sketchbooks and the kind of random accumulation that happens when you've lived in the same small apartment for 6 years. It was a drawing I'd made when I was 7 years old. A horse, technically, though it looked more like a dog wearing stilts, in crayon on wide-ruled notebook paper. My mother had found it once, when I was somewhere around 9 or 10, and had held it up with an expression that managed to be both indulgent and dismissive, and had said something like, "Sarah, is this what you've been doing instead of your homework?" I remembered that moment exactly. The kitchen table, the yellow light, the way the drawing looked somehow smaller when she was holding it. I'd thrown it away, or I'd thought I had. But apparently some part of me had retrieved it and kept it, tucked in a sketchbook and forgotten. And here it was now, faded and creased, and absolutely mine. I had it framed, a simple frame, clean white mat, hung it on the wall directly above my drafting table, directly in my eyeline when I'm working. A stilted horse in crayon by a 7-year-old who didn't know yet that she was going to win $47 million, or lose her family, or find out that the most important person in her life was the one who showed up soaking wet at 11 at night with an envelope of cash she'd been hiding from her husband. I look at it every morning when I sit down at the table, before I start work, with my coffee that's a little too strong, and it still makes me smile. Not because it's good, it's genuinely terrible, the horse has 5 legs, but because it's the earliest record I have of myself being myself, and nobody's opinion of it has ever actually mattered except mine. Simone started her training program in January, a certification in financial counseling that she'd been wanting to pursue for years and that had been, like everything in her life during those years, perpetually deferred. She finished in 4 months. By May, she'd set up a small foundation. Not enormous, not a big institutional thing, just a working nonprofit with a real budget and a specific focus. Direct financial assistance and legal referrals for people experiencing financial abuse within domestic relationships, specifically targeting people who faced the added barrier of professional licensing concerns. She named it the Rainy Night Fund. I sat with that name for a long time when she told me, because that's when help usually comes, she said, in the middle of the night when nobody's watching. I said, that's exactly right. She has 3 staff members now and a waiting list. She calls me on Sundays and we talk about her cases and my books and whatever dumb thing happened to each of us that week. And it's the best hour of any given Sunday. I've been asked by exactly one person, a friend from college who knew a version of my family story and heard fragments of this one, whether I feel bad about any of it, whether any part of me regrets the severity of it, the finality, the way it ended things. I've thought about that question more carefully than it might seem like it deserves. The answer I keep arriving at is no. But not because I didn't feel anything. I felt an enormous amount. I still do. There is a grief in the ruin of a family, even a family that was always a little ruined, even a family that turned a choice point into an opportunity to do something irreversible and then resented you for not going along with it. The grief is real. The loss is real. What I don't feel is regret, which is a different thing. Regret would require believing I had a better option, and I've thought about it from every angle I can access, and I don't think I did. Not if I was also going to protect Simone. Not if I was going to protect myself. Not if I was going to be the kind of person who looks at the stilted, 5-legged horse drawing on her wall every morning and believes it was worth making. There was a night, maybe 2 months after everything settled, when Simone came to Austin and stayed with me for a weekend. We ordered pizza, 2 kinds because we were adults who could order whatever we wanted, and we watched 3 episodes of a reality competition show about people building elaborate gingerbread structures, which is genuinely one of the best genres of television that exists. At some point, late, with the pizza box mostly empty on the coffee table, Simone said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Were you scared during any of it?" I thought about it honestly. I said yes, every day. But the scared feeling was different from when I used to be scared about money or about what they thought of me. It felt more like being scared because you're doing something real, not because you're being made small. Simone nodded slowly. Outside, it had started to rain. We both registered it at the same moment, the sound of it on the windows, the particular quality of rain at night in Austin, which has its own texture, its own rhythm. And we looked at each other and we both started laughing, which was the exact right response. That rainy night when Simone showed up at my door with $400 she couldn't afford, that was the moment my real family began. Everything else was just paperwork.